want to take a seat, or do you want to stand? We can do either. Let's just sit.
Take a seat.
Take a seat. Why not?
Fireside chat.
Exactly. I don't think you can stand by a fireside, right? You can't do that. So,
Does everybody really know me? I mean, you can raise your hand.
okay, good.
I appreciate that. Like, there's no way.
You had a Linux event, so I figured.
Fair.
Anyway, Jim. So, actually, speaking of which, like tomorrow you have the annual Linux Foundation Member Summit.
Yeah.
And a year ago, you gave a keynote there, and you talked about this problem that you were some existential risk that open source technology was facing around this problem of proving personhood and the need to do so in a decentralized way. Can you, first I want you to elaborate on that, but also are you as concerned as you were then now?
Yeah, I think more concerned. So if you go back a year ago, it actually started happening the year before. So in 2024 in particular, I think we all know the XE utils hack. This was a multi-year social engineering hack where a persona, Gia Tan, had been submitting code to a critical open source project and building up trust in that project. And essentially the identity of that persona was a GitHub account. And it got all the way up to the point of being given the commit bid, a maintainer role in that project, and then submitted malicious code. So this was like a multi-year social engineering hack. And that's when we started to realize that, trust is a lot different than security in this case. Or they're mutually reinforcing, but you can't have security without trust. And the idea of, being able to trust who has the commit bit for this critical software, the world's most critical software across the entire supply chain, became pretty important. And that's when we started talking about how can we set up a privacy-respecting system that would enable folks to establish identity so that people could be trusted to be able to maintain this critical software. And what's interesting is at the time, the Linux kernel already has this. Many of you might not know this, but you cannot be an anonymous contributor to the Linux kernel. You cannot be a maintainer of Linux kernel without a known identity, a government identity. And the way that the Linux kernel maintainers do this, about I think 150 or so people, is they do old school key signing parties where you bring your passport, you exchange keys, and okay, I know I can trust this person as they're contributing code. And that trust is really important because when you submit code as a trusted maintainer, that goes all the way up to Linus. He's going to look more favorably on that. He's going to spend a little less time on merging that code and reviewing it because he understands the trusted relationship and so on and so forth. But the problem with a key signing party is it doesn't scale. And, we'd all have to physically come somewhere. We'd have to show each other our passports or sharing keys. And so we're like, how do we create this system? And that's kind of where we started talking about this concept of first person.
It's actually interesting because there is a similar ceremony that we're doing here when people are downloading their H2H Connect app and then connecting with a person, in this case to verify that you're actually an attendee at an event, right? We can think about this now as something that moves beyond that physical space into a scalable global application.
That's right. So that urgency was already there. And the important thing is that we wanted to both be privacy respecting and also for open source communities to be able to set their own policies. So whenever you talk about KYC for developers, you talk about kind of global identity, in the open source community, this may surprise you, people get really pissed off and then the whole conversation devolves because they're like, well, is it going to be a biometric thing? Is it going to be centralized? Is the government going to be involved? How can I trust the government? Well, I don't want to use my real identity. I want to use a pseudonym. And what we're working on, and this is across many Linux Foundation projects, is how do you have a way for a project to say, okay, for you to be trusted, our policy is you have to have a known government ID. You can use a pseudonym. You have to have a known employer, let's say as one example, maybe not. And you have to have physically shown up in a verified way at some event. And then we ascribe a trust score to you based on that, maybe a number of events, maybe whether it's a government ID or not that you've had verified. And that trust score really enables everybody to get a better idea of, can I even trust this software before I use it? And remember, the policy is set by the project itself, And so if the project wants their software to be used, obviously the higher the trust score, the more people are going to trust and use that software. So it becomes this really interesting way of getting that job done. And we thought also, when you talk about a global, wide identity and credentialing program, again, it just kind of devolves into this okay, let me find every corner case. In open source, you kind of have this really interesting, immediate and urgent audience that needs to be able to trust each other to have code flow, but also are deeply cynical about privacy, are technologists themselves, so they can actually help in making the system even better. And so that's where I started talking to the Linux kernel developers and other crucial open source projects about, hey, would you be willing to kind of start this effort off? And that's how we got started.
So maybe talk a little bit about what's going on there, right? Because actually, so happens that Glenn Gore, the CEO of Affinity, that everyone will be meeting later on, is I think one of the leading devs actually sort of trying to help integrate first-person credentials into the kernel. So what's going on there?
Yeah, I think technologically there's been huge strides. I think one of the things that is becoming the bottleneck for it and things that we need to work on is standing up the kind of root of trust credentialing networks of who's verifying an identity, who's verifying a presence at an event and things like that. That's more than just a technology effort. That's kind of almost a business development effort. And that, of course, is happening a little slower than I might like. But what I think is really interesting that's happening right now, and why this is even more urgent than it was starting in 2024 and last year, is obviously AI is becoming more and more advanced, and the author of Curl, Daniel, talks a lot about Curl is one of the most critical open source projects out there, and he talks a lot about all this AI slop that's coming into him. It's like a AI DDoS of people who, with good intentions, are using AI to find bugs, and they're not really bugs, and they're all terrible, and they're not reproducible, and it's just been terrible. You talked about how there are projects that are ignoring all AI submitted code, and so that's some project solutions. You know what? We're just going to ignore all this stuff. But the question this year, I think that's most important is what code discovered by AI is code that you cannot ignore. And this is where the sophistication, particularly on the frontier, it matters. We're getting to a point where these LLMs are able to find security vulnerabilities very, very fast. They're able to figure out how to exploit them very, very quickly. And those vulnerabilities cannot be ignored. The Linux kernel is not going to ignore a 0-day. And the question is, if all of that code that you can't ignore is coming at you, how do you triage? How do you reproduce? How do you even merge it quickly enough? And so everything's happening fast.
Yeah. So in fact, a year ago when you gave that speech, the thing I think that had opened everyone's eyes to that risk back then, and it's a year later, it's probably a different risk, but was the XZUtils attack.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that was seen to be a state actor probably behind it, right?
Right.
Talk about what that was and why it was a wake-up call, but then what has changed since then in terms of the kind of threats that you face.
Yeah, I think that those attack vectors still exist. And so we need to urgently be able to establish trust in order to prevent other GATANs. We've done studies about if you had a relatively simple to implement policy for the kernel that just said, hey, you have to have a known identity, you can use a pseudonym, you have to have a known employer, or establish something like that and show it up at one event, how much would that reduce the threat of this attack vector? And the answer is quite a lot. GATAN would have had to fake a passport, move across an international border. Yeah, a state could go do that, but it'd be pretty hard. But I think the more important thing now, which is I think more urgent, is this idea of, okay, there's this advanced technology that's able to find 0 days very, very quickly. And on the adversarial side, people could use that. But also on the defender side, you can use that same technology. This is where the trust comes in. Who do you trust to be able to give the best possible tools to, so that this sort of maintainer, is Greg Kroll-Hartman or Linus here in the room? They'll get pissed at me for saying this, but like the maintainer bottleneck becomes an issue.
Human inefficiency.
Human inefficiency. And so I think maintainers can't ignore AI. They're going to have to use these AI tools. And if you're going to be able to defend, you're going to have to give access to these critical maintainers the best possible, most advanced tools. And that's where it comes back to this. You have to trust those people. And you have to have some way of figuring out that level of sophistication. And that's why I think right now it's more urgent than ever.
So one of the things we're going to be talking about throughout the day is, the interplay between this base level of human trust that you just mentioned, and then the agentic workflow after that, right? So and Tricia will be bringing forward this idea of proof of control, which is part of what the Advanced AI Society is all about. Yeah. And we see these two things coming together because at the end of the day, these agents are going to be dynamic and changing and shifting, and so it's not just enough to have that base layer of authority, but like, how do we continue? The maintainers are going to have to know how that system happens. So like some sort of just verifiable, consistent, auditable trail is what we're thinking about. But it brings me to my next question to you, because Linux Foundation is more than just the Linux kernel, right? You're essentially the most important, I would say, standards coordination body across open source technology broadly. And one of the other hats you've just recently been asked to put on is as the interim executive director of the Agentic AI Foundation. And this is the who's who of Silicon Valley in that group, right? We've got Anthropic, we've got Google, we've got OpenAI, we've got Salesforce, we have a whole bunch of very important, significant companies coming together, what seems to me, around a good cause, right? A common set of standards and open platforms, open models, open protocols as to how this unruly group of not normally collaborative organizations can set something that's a standard for everybody else. But I think we chose to have this event today ahead of your summit, which you will be obviously addressing this topic quite significantly, because we wanted to do, as I said at the opening, like, wait, right? Like, set this thing in place first. So what is your message to that world, right? How do you talk to the big guys and say, yeah, let's get these standards done, but where's the human piece in this?
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad you talk about standards, because one of the Linux Foundation's strategic initiatives is in a few years, there won't be any developers coding, and so we got to shift to standards. This whole open source developer thing is just going to go away. No, I'm just kidding. Nobody's going to show up for KubeCon anymore. It's going to be a bummer. I think that one of the things that I've been impressed with, first of all, the Agentic AI Foundation is growing so quickly. It seems like everything in AI is like dog years. Mm-hmm. The organization has already tripled in size in less than 2 months. It is I think it's a few months away from being bigger than our biggest initiative, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, like in less than six months. I mean, it's going really fast. What I am impressed by is whether it's David, who's the creator and maintainer of MCP, or the folks from OpenAI, or all the other frontier labs and folks who work in SaaS products that are, containing, enterprise critical data, financial information, and so forth, is they all recognize that there is a lot of work to be done to set up kind of the, maybe deterministic scaffolding is maybe a poor choice of words, but it's all the scaffolding around these protocols and this technology, so that we can have trust, so that we can do financial transaction. And so, one of the things that we did right away was set up working groups for the product leads at these organizations who are working on agentic solutions to come together and work on identity and trust, safety and governance, all of the things that are clearly not yet addressed in the agentic standards. And I think the sense of urgency there is also really, really high. To
get it.
Yeah, I think, there's millions of MCP downloads every month. Like, this thing is growing like gangbusters. We're all hooking it up to all of our critical data. And there is this huge sense of urgency that all of the other scaffolding around this is not sufficient, and that's really the core of what we're working on. So
Great.
I would say two things. One, if you're not already participating in the Agentic AI Foundation, come on in. We're working on the problems. We'd love to work with the folks in this room on the things that you are talking about today. We're having events that you can show up in, register early because they're selling out like hotcakes. And I'm one of these folks who's pretty optimistic about the future. I think that
We need those people.
Yeah, I think that if you work at the Linux Foundation long enough, you know that our kind of cultural catchphrase is helpful, hopeful, humble. Everybody at the Linux Foundation has to memorize this.
Well, we're H2H2H, in a way.
Exactly. We got to help the technologists to improve technology, co-collaborate on the standards that we are co-creating. You have to be optimistic because, we're at the very leading edge of technology, and it's easy to become cynical. But I think the most important thing, and this is, I think, important for this group as well, you have to have humility to know that one organization, one person doesn't have all of the solutions, and that's what I'm most hopeful about with this group. I'm going to leave right now and go to our Open Source Security Foundation board meeting. They're probably going to be yet another organization that wants to participate on first-person project initiatives because I think they, more than others, see this immediate and urgent threat around the speed at which these security vulnerabilities are being discovered, and it does come to the forefront, this concept of trust. And so I'll wrangle one more of our foundations to help.
Good to know. Yeah, we want everybody on board. Well, Jim, thank you so much for giving us that.
Appreciate it.